The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's edition of Democracy That Delivers. My name is Richard Christel. I'm a program officer here at the Center for International Private Enterprises Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. So today we'll be talking about beneficial ownership transparency in the fight against kleptocracy in our new report on the private sector use case for beneficial ownership transparency, written by experts Michael Barron and Tim Law. So just a very brief overview. Beneficial ownership transparency is the idea of who owns companies. And it intersects importantly with kleptocracy, as you could have a government official who submits a bid for a government procurement contract with his own anonymous shell company, which is a problem, as we don't want to encourage corruption. So we want to fight that corruption. And one of the tools we can do that is beneficial ownership transparency and knowing who owns the companies. We commissioned Michael Barron and Tim Law to look into a report on what it takes to get the private sector to use beneficial ownership transparency information. How could we get them involved in reform efforts, and what are the benefits for them to use beneficial ownership transparency data? So with that, our report touches on the micro and macro level benefits and uses of BOT data, and we also discuss the positions of private sector companies in the reform efforts, where they're either usually advocates for reform or resistors to reform. And we touch on, how we can move the needle a little bit, how we can shift them to advocate for reform or at least be neutral to it. We also discuss 3 case studies of our ongoing work in Kenya, Armenia, and Senegal, and provide some recommendations for actors there on BOT reform. This is the 4th edition of a podcast in this series. You can check out our show notes for the other ones in this series as well. But with that, one of the key things we've learned over the course of this research and over the course of our own experience working on BOT is the importance of coalitions between the NGO community and the private sector to successfully advocate for BOT reform. So today we have joining us Gary Kalman, the Executive Director of Transparency International US, and also Johannes Tonn, CIPE's Senior Anti-Corruption Advisor. Johannes, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Great to be on, Richard, and fantastic to have you here with us, Gary. Your contributions to the anti-corruption space in the US, but then also beyond, are always tremendously helpful. Let me briefly talk about the goal of this podcast, which is really a twofold goal, and work then toward my first question for you. So in terms of the goals for this podcast, let's talk about beneficial ownership transparency and whether, and perhaps to what extent, it does make sense to widen the coalition of beneficial ownership transparency supporters to include the private sector, to make additional progress on the implementation of BO reform. And second, if we were to agree that it does make sense to widen that coalition of reformers, of private sector reformers, how do we go about that? What does it look like in practice to rope in the private sector? And what are some of the lessons learned that you have learned, Gary, including perhaps through your extensive experience in shepherding a coalition of beneficial ownership supporters in the US, which I think was managed by you and a handful of others, and which, if I understand correctly, culminated then in the passage of the Corporate Transparency Act in 2021, and is still ongoing, perhaps, with FinCEN trying to finalize regulations that you're still working toward making as impactful as possible. So before I pose my question, let me just assert for a minute that there is no disagreement in our anti-corruption space about the fact that we need more private sector involvement. We do have, on the one hand, agreed upon standards by the Financial Action Task Force, by the G7, G20, etc. We have a number of treaties and conventions and a whole range of countries and governments that have committed to beneficial ownership reform. We have established beneficial ownership laws and regulations and registers that have been established. In addition, we have both government and civil society-led initiatives to advocate for stronger registers, for better verification regimes, and for the publication of data. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative and Open Ownership are just two of those who push into that direction. And amongst all of our allies, there's really no doubt that the information would help us to do all the many things we believe are really important, which is to support law enforcement and journalists in detecting and uncovering ownership structures, to fight back against kleptocracy, to follow the money, to curb illicit financial flows, and to fight tax evasion, maybe counter terrorist financing. All these things are really good and important. But then the question is, how do we make this case to the private sector? Does that narrative about tax evasion and about illicit financial flows really help us get the private sector on board to push beneficial ownership reform? Are they excited, and do they want to join a coalition if we lead with that? Now, in our report, and obviously I'm leading with this question, in our report, we're trying to make the case, no, that's not enough. You need to really focus on the private sector benefits that beneficial ownership reform can produce. Maybe save money on compliance with regard to anti-money laundering regulation, know your customer diligence, due diligence, protect against crime and fraud throughout your supply chains, improve the investment climate. All these benefits that private sector can derive, we think, when we wrote them into a reform to push BO legislation and reform more generally. So here's my question then. How do you think about the value of engaging the private sector? Is it fair to assert that we need to partner more often, more frequently with the private sector, or is there perhaps some nuance to this assertion? And I wonder what your experience is engaging with the private sector in the US on this. Over to you.
Thanks, Johannes, and thanks, CIPE and all, for inviting me to speak on the podcast today. Really appreciate the opportunity. And I think your question is an important question, and it goes to how we were able to move beneficial ownership legislation in the United States. It took 12 years to move from the original bill that was introduced to final passage. And I think along the way, and the reason we were able to win in the end was because we had converted a number of opponents to supporters, especially in the business community. Look, any new regulation or rulemaking or new sort of regulatory regime is going to be met with skepticism, I think, from the regulated community, making sure that it's something that makes sense and is not overly burdensome, et cetera, et cetera. And in the beginning, we did not appreciate that. And so largely the business community set out in opposition. We slowly began to understand and began to appreciate ourselves how this could benefit the business community and started to go and make the case. And let me give you one story that I think is emblematic of the way in which the education program that we did was helpful in changing minds. So the banking community, the financial services community, in the beginning, they were neutral on the bill and followed the rest of the business community's concerns and so stayed silent. When we started talking to them and they began to realize that they themselves could better meet their own anti-money laundering customer due diligence obligations, they began to take another look. And at a press conference when a bill was introduced in 2016, so this is 7 or so years after the original bill was introduced, a reporter asked the leader of one of the banking associations why it's taken them 7 years to get onto the bill, to which he responded, "No one ever asked me before." And so that began for us a journey to reach out to many members of the business community. And once we did, we were pleasantly surprised with what we found. There were a number of large businesses that came on board because they saw the importance of beneficial ownership transparency to the integrity of their supply chains, making sure that they are defending themselves against inadvertently getting involved with sanctioned individuals or other rogue actors. There was a poll that we took, worked with a small business organization here in the United States to ask whether or not small businesses were more concerned about the burden of reporting their ownership or more concerned about losing contracts, government contracts that were set aside for small business and other contracts and vetting their supply chains, that those concerns because they did not know the beneficial owner. The survey came back with 70+% of small businesses were more in favor of reporting the information and getting that information than they were concerned about the regulatory burden. And so that transformation, I think, helped get legislators' attention that this is actually something that can be universally supported. We never won over the entire business community. I don't want to suggest we did, but we got enough of the business community in different sectors of the business community to recognize the importance of this information, and that helped us get it across the finish line.
Well, with that, Gary, I mean, in getting it over the finish line and interacting with the business community, I guess if you were making recommendations to other countries trying to undergo a BOT reform, what recommendations would you make to these campaigners? How would you recommend they interact with the business community? I guess, obviously it varies from context to context, but what do you think are some generalizable lessons you could apply to most contexts?
The biggest lesson that I not only believe strongly, but we have sort of preached since the passage of the bill and are now using this in additional advocacy efforts, is to tell people, don't prejudge, talk to everyone. There is a sort of historic skepticism between the NGO community oftentimes and the business community. And they just assume that they know what the answer is because they assume the worst, often, sadly, of the other side. And I would urge you to put aside those predetermined notions and go and talk to people, because I think you'd be pleasantly surprised. Ask the right questions. The two sides are not going to agree on everything. And so don't turn this into a broader political debate. But on the issue of beneficial ownership transparency, we are talking about something that is widely supported across all sectors. So the first thing is, please just talk to everyone and see what you find. The second, I think, is that, in the United States, our case was somewhat what happens here in the United States. And there's certainly, fraud and corruption here in the United States. I don't mean that there isn't, but in other countries, there is perhaps even more challenging environments where the rule of law is less secure. And so businesses face all kinds of obstacles, not only in country, but also extraterritorially. So the United States will go after anyone who violates the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and, pays a bribe. And so or if you are even many businesses, as you may know, contract with local officials to help them navigate the permitting and licensing process. And where a number of FCPA violations have occurred is where the businesses themselves were not paying the bribe, but the people that they contracted with were engaged in facilitation payments that were questionable. And so understanding who you're dealing with is critically important. I think, in fact, even more so perhaps in other jurisdictions than here. But nonetheless, I think those arguments are very powerful. And I'll say this, and this could be a little bit controversial on a podcast like this, but a little bit of corruption throughout the world and in various jurisdictions, sometimes businesses learn how to deal with that, and they learn how to navigate those landmines, maybe turning a blind eye to some of the lesser egregious examples, but trying to figure out how to negotiate that. It feels to me, and the feedback that we've gotten is that corruption has really skyrocketed around the world. And when you have systemic corruption across regions and across continents, that's unsustainable for any business. And I think we're seeing businesses understand in this new landscape, they can't sort of turn a blind eye to it or hope that they don't get caught up in it in the way that they had in the past. And I don't mean to say that businesses were willfully going in and, violating laws, but I do think that inadvertently or somewhere down the food chain or supply chain, there was something nefarious that went on, and they were not as diligent as they are now about making sure that they're not going to get caught up in both a reputational or a legal battle. So with that, this information even becomes more important. And I think those arguments are going to resonate a lot more now than they did, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
I just want to touch on a point you mentioned just a little bit earlier, though. So you said the trust between the NGO community and businesses in the private sector can sometimes be a little bit lacking. They sometimes view each other at odds, or kind of, maybe demonize is a strong word, but certainly don't appreciate the other party. So I guess when you were starting this BOT campaign here in the States, how'd you sort of break down that stigma? How'd you build up trust with the private sector community? Was that easy, or did you approach them and they were just like, don't put us on the stand, don't pillory us, we're not here for that, we're here to engage collaboratively? How did that work?
interestingly enough, from both sides, when we started talking with the financial services sector, which was the first private sector set of companies that we approached, we got pushback from our own coalition, from the NGO community, saying we can't trust them. If we start partnering with them, at the end of the day, they're going to cut a deal that's going to undermine the law. And they really believed that. And I think what's important is to understand, if you are getting into a coalition with anyone, whether it's somebody who seems like a natural ally or an unlikely ally, you need to know why they're joining the coalition. And if they're doing it for reasons that you don't think are because ultimately they see the benefits of a policy change, then I think whether or not you normally work with them or don't work with them on a regular basis, you need to be careful about that coalition. We were very clear about why the banks were getting interested in this particular policy change, and it's because their own customer due diligence rules had been revised. They needed this information. The key thing that we knew they were going to push for was to make sure that they had appropriate access. And we also knew that they wanted to make sure the information was accurate so they could rely on it. Well, we want as many parties to see this information as possible. So having them push for open and broad access seemed to fit within our own goals, as well as making sure that the information is verified. We saw the disaster in the UK when they set up the directory, and the information was not verified or validated in any way. You saw a number of bogus entries that were clearly, just random letters and numbers generated as the ownership interest of the company. So those two pieces seemed to us to be a natural fit and in complete agreement with the kinds of goals that we had. When we approached other large businesses and talked to them about the value of this information, we heard that one company had, and I understand this actually isn't that big anymore, but I thought it sounded like a lot at the time, 15,000 entities in their supply chain. I understand that some have many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands globally in their supply chain.
I would have made that same assumption.
Yeah, no, I thought that sounded like a lot. So I said 15,000, and then somebody said, oh yeah, well, we have way more than that. So the idea, even for large companies that are quote unquote capable of doing their own due diligence and they don't need additional information, thank you very much, find that beneficial ownership transparency in a public registry can actually be quite helpful to them, because there is no company in the world that has those kinds of resources to invest in doing the kinds of due diligence that you would want to do to be truly secure in your supply chains. So that motivated a number of companies. And once you get 2 or 3 companies to sign on and you get a couple of sectors, then the others are open to talking with you. And I think it began to flow from there.
So that makes perfect sense to me, to really be clear about the incentives of all the parties that you want to enlist in your coalition, and to just work with that and be really clear and double check time and time again, are we still aligned on that? I think this work that you've done there is also mirrored by other work that we're seeing in the anti-corruption space taking place in other sectors. And I'm thinking Mark Pyman and Paul Haywood on curbing corruption, where it's really about going to the private sector and asking, look, what are the biggest issues that you face, and which ones of those issues are comfortable for you to tackle, which ones are not. Obviously, that doesn't mean that by engaging companies on that front that you solve all anti-corruption issues. But what it does mean is that you can identify 1 or 2 or 3 pieces that may be worthwhile working on jointly within a broader coalition. The other piece, though, that struck me, Gary, is that you said earlier it took 12 years. And my question to you is, how did you manage the process of being able to follow up on a reform process over the course of 12 years? What does that mean if you're an NGO person? How do you manage the expectations of funders, of people who sort of you're aligned with over that period of time? How do you help them believe that you're still on track to get something done without them despairing and saying, oh, look, Gary has been working on this for the past 8 years. Now it's the 9th year. How have you done that?
Well, I would put our fight here and our effort in the United States into 2 eras, if you will. The first, I think, is from around 2008 or so, when Senator Carl Levin first introduced the bill, through 2016. where the coalition was largely NGOs. They did not expand the coalition beyond sort of the usual suspects. They had a few law enforcement officials that signed on to the campaign, which are not necessarily working on a regular basis with some of these human rights and anti-corruption NGOs. But they didn't get very far. In fact, they introduced bills. I'm not sure that they had a hearing after the first sort of Carl Levin Senate hearings, let alone any kind of markup or movement on the bill. In 2016 is when I more fully joined the fight, and we decided to do a number of things. One is there hadn't been broad engagement with the administration. There hadn't been broad engagement with other constituency groups outside of sort of the usual anti-corruption and human rights organizations. And so we stepped that up, and I think that energized a few of the funders to see that. So I can't really speak too much before then, but they began to see a new strategy and a much broader strategy that moved the bill. And from there, it was about 4 years or so about 5 years that it took to pass the bill. So it wasn't 12-year fight in that respect. It was a 5-year fight. And they began to see a couple of things. One is gaining allies that they had never thought they'd see on a beneficial ownership bill. Two is we began to get hearings. We saw other organizations putting out reports, and this is not just the U.S., I have to say, but the global community began to talk about beneficial ownership in a much more heightened fashion. And so it began to look as though beneficial ownership, well, not just look, it actually was the reality that beneficial ownership became one of the leading goals of the anti-corruption community, and they saw that happening globally. I think in your report you identified now 121 countries have made commitments to beneficial ownership transparency. 50 some odd have started to take concrete steps towards implementing those. And so the combination of interest globally, new allies, interesting allies, a change in strategy began to interest funders in a way that, or at least re-energize funders in a way that we couldn't have done otherwise. And so I would urge folks looking at these campaigns to skip the first 7 years and go out and create a diverse coalition at the outset. And I think you'll save yourself a lot of time and you'll begin to move things more quickly.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice, if it's possible to do that precisely. One of the questions that I always have in my mind is, when people talk about political will, to me, and I know I'm not alone on this, that is somewhat of a straw idea, because it is us collectively creating that political will. And I think what I see in that coalition building effort of yours and in other coalitions that have been built around anti-corruption topics across the world, there is this oftentimes hidden implicit notion of how do we actually get there? How do we convince enough people to put enough pressure on whether it's parliament, whether it's a particular enforcement agency, to really do that extra step and implement in a meaningful way? And I wonder if on that notion, if you have ideas or thoughts about how to move the needle for us globally to indeed create that political will. So, and in my mind, at least, building coalitions is one piece of that. But I wonder if you have additional advice or thoughts about how to craft the foundation for people to move ahead and really take action on anti-corruption.
I do, and let me first say that now you're about to get truly, this is Gary Kalman speaking, not necessarily Transparency International or the broader NGO community. I believe that we often are not humble enough, and people would say, oh, we need to be bold. Well, we do need to be bold, but we also need to be humble. And what I mean by that is I should be able, because I am a smart, intelligent expert in this area, I should be able to go to public officials and they should listen to what I say. And if they're not going to listen to what I say, I'm going to get more people like me to go and say, no, he's really right. And you win it on the merits. Where you have interested parties in the government in doing the right thing, sure, that is the right way to go. And God bless people, they should just go for it. But more often than not, when we talk about political will, what we're talking about is trying to convince people that are not inclined to take up these kinds of policies. And in that case, all the best arguments in the world are not going to be able to move the needle. You need to have them. I don't mean to say that the reports and the research and the data need to be there. A, because you want to know that you're right in pushing a particular policy. So if nothing else, to satisfy yourself that you are pushing a policy that is meaningful. But without going out and creating a broad coalition, without including other stakeholders, you can't change the political math. And that's what you're trying to do here. And so, we talk about the NGO and business community being unlikely allies, but we also had civil rights organizations and the Fraternal Order of Police and other law enforcement agencies at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests here in the United States. They weren't sitting down in the same rooms or signing on to the same letters in very many other types of settings. But they had done it on one other issue, and we thought that there would be an opportunity to talk to them about this, and we did. And so I wouldn't underestimate the value of having a diverse set of voices is the first thing. Yes, each individual advocate is smart. You're an expert. Kudos to you for doing all the good research and the right developing of the data. But where there's not the natural political will, you need to change the political math, and that's going to involve other constituencies and other voices. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, in order to get those voices, you need to be able to look at different types of arguments. The NGO community here in the United States pushing beneficial ownership originally was interested in economic justice, was interested in human rights, was interested in things that, sure, individuals and businesses may be interested in, but that's not their mission. And it is not necessarily going to persuade the leadership of an entity or an organization to come on board and support a policy. And so we started talking about the business case for beneficial ownership. When we went to law enforcement, wouldn't it be nice if you could, actually look up? You keep trying to find the drug kingpins or the people behind the human trafficking operations, and you can't do it. There was a study done by an anti-trafficking organization called Polaris here in the United States, and they found that I think it was between 70 and 80% of the cases that they looked at of illicit massage businesses here in the United States, they looked at 6,000 businesses. Of all the businesses, about between 70 and 80% had no one listed as the owner of the business. The local law enforcement could go in and raid a facility, arrest the women that had been trafficked, but the next day they would set up another new anonymous company, move across the street, an operation, shipping in a whole bunch of new women, and the operation would continue. I don't know that many in our coalition had thought about that as a reason for beneficial ownership transparency, but we picked that up and began to recruit a number of individuals that had never thought that beneficial ownership transparency related to them. I remember there was a story about one of the drug cartels was laundering money through an anonymously held horse farm. In fact, they were so bold that one of the horses was called Number One Cartel, based out of New Mexico. I'm not making these stories up. This is really true. And so you begin to talk to law enforcement about these stories, and they say, yeah, I can't tell you the number of cases I've had to drop because I couldn't get past square one because the company that was running the illegal operation was anonymously owned. So begin to look at other arguments. It's not necessarily that your organization is saying that those are priority arguments for your organization, but they do need to be priorities if you're going to build a coalition, and it's going to be part of the mix of arguments in order to get those unlikely allies. So those are the two sort of observations I think I would share.
Well, I want to go back to that first point you mentioned, like getting other constituencies on board. And just when we talk about beneficial ownership transparency, it's more than just the owners of the companies themselves. It's the lawyers, the accountants, the business formation agents who help them establish these companies and sometimes, use them for illicit means like money laundering or tax evasion or whatever. And I'm wondering, we shouldn't just view BOT reform in a vacuum, right? It's one thing to know the company owners, but it's another to regulate the people who make these companies, these shell companies or these illicit companies possible. So I'm wondering, how can we, is there an ideal regulation scheme for these enablers? Is there any country out there that you can think of has a good thing going when it comes to regulating these enablers? And what do you think, what do you think we could do better for monitoring and regulating these constituencies?
That's a great question. And as we've said throughout the fight for beneficial ownership transparency, we believe that this is a foundational reform. And by that, I mean, it's the first step. It's not the only step. Think about it. I sometimes compare it to building of a house. If you build a house and you only build the foundation, but not the rest of it, you can't live in it, right? But if you build the house without the foundation, it's going to fall apart. So we have to have beneficial ownership transparency as a fundamental foundational reform. Without that, we're never going to be able to find out who's behind these entities or have any kind of ability to restrict people from just using them for nefarious purposes. Once we do that, I think there is a second piece to this, and that is ensuring that those that have facilitated the establishment of trusts or companies anonymously or helped to move money around the globe, that they need to have some responsibilities. And we already do this globally. I think, most countries have responsibilities for financial institutions. We now recognize that money, and there's been reports from numerous countries about the real estate sector being used for money laundering, probably the most. We've also seen, as some countries started cracking down on the real estate sector, money moving to the private investment sector. Right here in the United States, the public sector actually does have money laundering responsibilities. So we know that anti-money laundering responsibilities are possible in the investment sector. But we have this gaping loophole for our private investment sector. And here in the United States, just as an example, it's an 11 or $12 trillion market, just the private investment markets. If it was its own country, it would be the fourth largest economy or third largest economy in the world. So it is a large amount of money, easy to hide a few $1 billion in that kind of market. We need to make sure, we know it can be done, and we need to make sure that we extend anti-money laundering responsibilities to some of these, quote, gatekeepers to the financial system. The reality is, you asked, are there examples? And let me just say this. As with, unfortunately, many of our anti-corruption laws, most of Europe has responsibilities for real estate and other gatekeepers to the financial system. They are in place. Unfortunately, the enforcement of some of these laws is fairly low, and we need to really begin focusing on enforcement. If there are logistical reasons that it's not being enforced, that is, the laws weren't written carefully and they need to be modified so that the businesses have an easier time complying, then we should have those conversations. But we need to make sure that we start enforcing the laws that are already on the books and that we've already agreed our priorities to counter this kind of activity.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Gary, for all your time today. It's truly been a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and I hope the listeners learned a lot as well. Please check out the link to the report, The Private Sector Use Case for Beneficial Ownership Transparency, will be in the show notes. And Gary, is there anything that you'd like to promote from Transparency International's side?
Just following up on that last question and answer, in the coming months, we hope to be able to produce a couple of pieces looking globally at both laws around the world on the real estate sector and anti-money laundering rules for the investment sector. And we're going to be comparing them to each other and to where the United States is at, and seeing where the sort of trends are moving and what are emerging global norms. So we'd encourage people to look for that. I think it'll be informative, especially for folks that are working anywhere around the world.
Well, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk to you later.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit CIPE.org.